Right, let's go. So I woke up this morning and I thought to myself, what's the best Pink Floyd album? Of course, that didn't actually happen because this video is planned days in advance, but I need to say something for the intro, so just allow it. So after I woke up, I randomly just decided, you know what, we'll turn this into a YouTube video. Look, I'm sure Pink Floyd don't need much of an introduction at this point, but for those of you who are still living under that massive rock of yours, Pink Floyd are a legendary and seminal progressive rock band, and they created some of the most commercially successful as well as compelling rock music in the history of the genre. Now look, I'm not going to be discussing all of Pink Floyd's 15 albums in this video because this video would be about an hour and a half long if I were to do that. So instead I'm going to pick the 4 albums that pretty much everyone knows and most people generally agree are Pink Floyd's best work. And of course I'm referring to the prolific and legendary 4-album run that Pink Floyd had in the 1970s, which consists of the albums The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals and The Wall. I'm sorry if your favourite Pink Floyd album is like Medal or Piper at the Gates of Dawn or an album like that. Shout out to those albums though, those are pretty good. But if your favourite Pink Floyd album is something like, I don't know, Uma Guma or that soundtrack album More, then wow, please get me some of whatever you're smoking. The Wall, it's the final album in this 4-album run and it arguably shoots for the most ambitious concept of any of the 4 albums here, delving into the isolation and the loneliness that often accompanies being a rock star. This isolation is often referenced throughout the album with references to a metaphorical wall, which they touch upon in many tracks. While I am intrigued by the concept and the ambition behind The Wall, I can't help but think it's a little bit overblown in comparison to the other 3 albums. Let's put this in perspective. The other 3 albums are all just over 40 minutes in length. Compare that to The Wall, which is over 80 minutes in length, double the runtime. Now look, obviously this album is intentionally more theatrical than the other albums in the bunch, as it's also connected to the film of the same name, The Wall. However, there's still a number of interludes and meandering songs on this album that I feel could have been cut out or explored a bit differently. Still though, I massively admire the attention to detail that went into constructing the narrative and the plot of The Wall, and it's obviously still one of Pink Floyd's best albums. It also features some fantastic Pink Floyd songs. We have Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, which is one of their most famous songs. The incredibly tense and dramatic Don't Leave Me Now. And of course, Comfortably Numb is also on this album, one of Pink Floyd's biggest songs as well. There's so many songs and so many ideas on here to really dive deeply into. Also, is it only me that thinks Comfortably Numb's a bit overrated in the grand scheme of things? There are some people that think Comfortably Numb is like the greatest piece of art ever conceived by mankind. You're tripping. It's great, but you're tripping. This is pretty weird. This album was gonna land at my number 2 spot on this list. I already kind of had an idea for where I was going to place each album, but when I was revisiting and re-listening to these 4 albums to plan for this video, this album ended up slipping down to the number 3 spot. Anyway, what can I actually say about Dark Side of the Moon that hasn't already been said? I guess I'll say this: it's one of the most popular, iconic, and widely celebrated albums ever recorded. This is also the album that kicked off Pink Floyd's incredible creative streak in the 70s. The Dark Side of the Moon largely revolves around universal themes which everybody can relate to or understand on some level, which I think is part of the reason it has the legacy it has. The band explores the concept of time and how little time we actually have on tracks like Breathe, and of course, Time. They touch on the greedy nature of humans hoarding all of their money on the song Money, which is so classic sounding at this point. I only heard this album about 3 years ago, but as soon as I heard the track Money, I was like, yes, this is just a cornerstone of the 1970s. In terms of culture, music and all that stuff, this song just sounds like, you know, one of the best representatives of that era. Another prominent theme on this album is the inevitability of death, which they explore most thoroughly on the track The Great Gig in the Sky, and I remember first listening to this song, man, it moved me and it instantly became my favourite song of all time by anybody. And while I don't think it would quite hold up to that same standard nowadays because I've listened to so much more music since, that's just an example of the kind of power this album can have at its best. I personally think that this album deserves at least most of the praise and status that it's garnered over the years. Yes, there are some people that think Dark Side of the Moon, again, is like the greatest cultural work from any human being ever, and it's not quite on that level, but it is still a fantastic album. It's easily the band's greatest and most iconic album. I don't think anyone could really doubt or refute that point. But for me personally, I think Pink Floyd continue to push themselves and evolve their sound with their later albums in the 70s, namely the next two on the list. I feel like Animals, musically speaking, is a little bit of an outlier in comparison to the other three on the list. And here's the reason I say that. Pink Floyd are obviously known for their ambitious concept albums, and quite clearly Animals is no exception to that. But a lot of Pink Floyd naysayers, as well as people who just don't really like progressive rock that much, often say that these concepts seem like quite dry, quite dull, boring, pretentious, depressing, and anything else you want to call them. I feel like you could throw those critiques at all three of the other albums, and even though I love all of them, I could kind of see where you're coming from. They do tend to address these topics in a way that is quite sad, quite reflective, quite contemplative. Animals, by comparison, feels like an intentional step away from that kind of reputation Pink Floyd had built up for themselves. This album finds David Gilmour and Roger Waters critiquing human behaviour and society at large, comparing human behaviour to multiple different animals across the album. Whether that be comparing the competitive nature of the business world to the aggressive nature of dogs on the track Dogs, or comparing the way that humans blindly conform and subscribe to ideologies on the track Sheep. Animals does pretty well in maintaining the long-form compositions as well as the shifting musical passages that are typical of progressive rock. I mean, look at the three core tracks on this album, they're all 10 plus minutes. However, there's also an energy and an element of directness to this album that isn't really present on their other classic works. And believe it or not, I kind of think that the directness of a lot of the songwriting and the instrumentation on here kind of reminds me of punk in a way. Now look, obviously Animals is not like Pink Floyd's Nevermind the Bollocks or anything. Like, this is not as straightforward or as crude as a lot of the stuff that the punk bands of the 70s were making in reaction to bands like Pink Floyd. But the uniqueness of this album in comparison to the other three is just something that I really like and I really enjoy. And it's grown on me so much since I listened to it for the first time. I remember listening to it for the first time and I just didn't get it for Pink Floyd's best album. I thought it was number 4 out of these 4 albums. And I started seeing this massive cult of Animals worshippers who were all like, "Ah, you're all filthy plebs, Animals is the best album, I don't know what you're all talking about." And I've seen a lot of people across the internet, whether it be professional critics or just random people in forums and comment sections and stuff, who were all saying that Animals is the best Pink Floyd album. It seems like there's quite a large group of people who are trying to push this narrative. So that kind of made me go back to it, and now, you know, it is up there. It's my number 2. It's pretty obvious at this point which album is number 1. So, yeah, let's talk about that. Wish You Were Here, in my opinion, is Pink Floyd's best work. To me, this is the band's most emotionally resonant and powerful musical statement. Which is pretty strange for me to say, because I genuinely feel that the topics on this album that they discuss, such as greed in the music industry, as well as tributing the former band member Syd Barrett, are less ambitious and grand in theory than the concepts that you'll find on Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall. But it's Pink Floyd's masterful execution of their ideas on Wish You Were Here that makes me say it's their best album. There's the amazing 9-part Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which is split into 2 halves and bookends the album, which musically sees the band create this beautiful and intoxicating atmosphere, and lyrically it acts as a heartfelt tribute to their former band member Syd Barrett, who departed from the band about 7 years before the release of this album. There's also the very dramatic and intense Welcome to the Machine, where David Gilmour sings passionately about coldness and greed in the music industry. The band addresses this same topic on the next song, Have a Cigar, but it's in a clearly more sarcastic and upbeat tone, where the lyrics are written from the perspective of a completely clueless label executive who just wants to exploit the band for his own advantage. And of course the title track, Wish You Were Here, is just one of the most emotionally powerful and moving songs that the band ever released. Wish You Were Here has a great flow from track to track, it explores its narrative extremely well, and for me, that's why it's Pink Floyd's best album. Just a quick reminder, I do think all of these albums are really great. This was a ranking of Pink Floyd's top 4 albums, or what people generally consider to be their top 4 albums, so naturally I'm going to have positive things to say about each one. If you want to get into Pink Floyd's discography but you haven't done so quite yet, then I recommend starting with these 4 albums, maybe listen to them in order from Dark Side of the Moon to The Wall, but you can really go about it how you want. I mean, for me, I listen to their discography literally in order, starting with their debut album. But I don't always think that's the best way to get into a band or an artist's discography. I think it's probably better for you to start with the best stuff. And if you like what you hear from the best stuff, you can explore the stuff that might be a bit less well known. At least that's usually how I go about it when I'm exploring a band or an artist that has a really big discography like Pink Floyd. Anyway, that draws this video to a close. You can find the links to my Twitter as well as my 2 Instagram accounts. Yes, I have a personal and a music related Instagram. Those will be in the description, but for now, I'll see you in the next video.